shift our focus to another transformative force, innovating financing. Africa's development story requires bold and creative approaches to unlock untapped capital and drive sustainable growth. So this next session will explore how we can reimagine financing, leveraging new models and impact investment to bridge the gap between ambition and realization. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, because she's a distinguished leader whose expertise in finance and development is helping drive Africa's economic growth. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming to deliver the opening remarks for this session, Vice President for Finance and Chief Financial Officer at the African Development Bank Group, Hassatoun Sele, ladies and gentlemen.
Very good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this AIF and for being with us today for this panel. I'm delighted to welcome you to this important discussion on innovating financing models. In a world marked simultaneously by unprecedented challenges and numerous opportunities, the discussions we engage in today can well shape the development landscape across Africa and beyond. As the Vice President for Finance of the African Development Bank Group, I am acutely mindful of the critical financing gap our continent faces. Africa brims with potential, a dynamic and useful population, abundant natural resources, and rapidly growing economies. Yet, despite these promises, we continually confront substantial barriers in mobilizing the resources necessary for sustainable development. The crisis that we're facing today is multifaceted and top of our general challenges, such factors as climate change, deepening social inequalities, and the lingering effect of the pandemic. Geopolitical tensions have intensified the need for innovative solutions. At the African Development Bank, we know that innovation is more than just a tool. It is a necessity. Our ability to mobilize resources effectively relies heavily on our partnerships with various stakeholders. We know that when our interests align with those of governments, businesses, civil society, we can accomplish transformative projects that address the urgent needs within our communities. The synergy created through these partnerships amplifies our collective impact. It also builds a foundation for sustainable change. And the African Investment Forum is such an innovation. Our commitment to financial innovation is central to redefining how we mobilize resources. We at the African Development Bank recognize that our mandate of combating poverty and improving lives on the African continent is formidable, and our capital finite and limited. And this is why we are not just about lending, but we are about attracting additional resources into the continent, playing a catalytic role, playing a counter-cyclical role. And we've been focusing on substantially expanding our financial capacity beyond the shareholders' capital. You've heard about the risk transfer transactions that we've done. We launched the first synthetic securitization transaction by a multilateral development bank in 2018, which received many accolades from the international community. And Tim Turner, who is one of your speakers, used to be the chief risk officer of the bank, as was one of the architects of this groundbreaking transaction. This transaction has contributed to help transform the perception of African risk. We had first-time investors that had never bought African risk taking a slice of our portfolio and knocking back at our doors. And we are incredibly proud to see that this was replicated by the Inter-American Development Bank with our full support as part of their originate to distribute model. And I like to say that the African Development Bank is the original originator to distribute. And there is more coming on that front, as you will see later today. And in line with the G20 recommendations for multilateral development banks to be better, bigger, and more effective, we've embraced financial innovation again through hybrid capital. We did the first hybrid capital transaction sustainable by an MDB. It received lots of positive reviews. Quite exciting to see the $6 billion demand for a 750 million transaction, more than 270 investors. And it's the start of a new asset class. We've been leading the way in discussions around a hybrid capital-based solution for challenging SDRs to multilateral development banks. And we are very happy to see that the International Monetary Fund, whom we worked with from the very beginning, have given this solution that we've developed in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank a lot of traction and support. And I see that Dr. Mouhedine, who was here earlier on the stage, was extremely, extremely helpful in helping us advance the discussion at the IMF. So thank you very much for this. Just very quickly on the SDR channeling, because this is something that is really close to my heart. It's basically being in a room with people that are dying of hunger, and you have that beautiful buffet, self-replenishing, that nobody wants to touch. Don't touch it. Why? SDR channeling, what does it mean? It means that today, developed countries that have large amounts of reserves can use a portion of these reserves and lend them, not donate, but lend them to multilateral development banks. And the beauty of the solution that we've developed is that if they lend $20 billion to AAA-rated multilateral development banks, we, the AAA-rated MDBs, can in turn generate $800 to $200 billion of additional financing capacity. What does it cost the country? Nothing. Why? First, because those $20 billion transforming into $200 billion that they are lending to us, they can still continue to account for it as being part of their reserves. And that's what the IMF indicated. Furthermore, it is a loan. So we are matching whatever they can get from this loan, and we're even willing and ready to add a small margin on top of that. So it's costing exactly zero. So today, there is, at a time where many of the developed countries are indicating that they have tight fiscal space, SDR channeling is a solution. So the same way that the G20 have asked multilateral development bank to embrace innovation, to do more, we are also asking our shareholders to embrace innovation. So I urge you today, each one of you, to think creatively and pragmatically about the financing models we can embrace. Let us challenge the status quo and explore how we can bridge the financing gap, turning challenges into opportunities and dreams into tangible realities. We can, we should, and we need to address developing countries, Africa's challenges once and for all. The MDGs were not attained. The SDGs are not going to be attained for Africa by 2030. And we will have a new set of DGs afterwards, while we have the means today to make change. Why? Why are we waiting? Thank you.
Many thanks, Assatou. And now that you have set the stage, and to lead us in this pivotal conversation, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Jean-Paul Djemba Abesolo, Chairman and CEO of Mata Capital. Ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I will ask them to, all of them to stand up and come, and I will be introducing them. So please welcome Ms. Lamia Merzouki. She is the Deputy Managing Director of Casablanca Finance City and the Chief Operating Officer. Please welcome Mr. Akin Daoudou, who is Citi's CEO for Sub-Saharan Africa. Please welcome Farouk Muhammad, who is the Managing Director of Standard Chartered Bank. Please welcome Tim Turner, who is currently Senior Advisor to the President at TBD. Please welcome Riyad Yusuf, who is a partner at Goldman Sachs. I think Asatu has set up the context. We are all aware that Africa has a huge financing gap, and the Africa Development Bank estimates that Africa has about close to 200 billion infrastructure gap annually. And clearly what we have seen is that traditional financing sources have not managed to bridge that gap. And in today's panel, with these experts, we're going to be talking about the existing innovative financing models, but also the emerging ones. Without further ado, I would like to start with Lamia. And Lamia, I just want us to share with the audience what Casablanca City Finance City is doing in terms of mobilizing more capital, not only for its members, but in general, to address this financing gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Yassine, and all the AFDB team for the invitation. Well, actually, we may try to develop the most cutting-edge financing tools and groundbreaking instruments if we don't have the right enabling environment, and if we don't have the right combination of on-the-ground expertise and highly skilled talent pool, we will not be able to unlock the potential of those instruments. And this is where actually business and financial centers come into play, because one of our main roles is to put in place a conducive environment. And today, for instance, in CFC, this is why we have the privilege to host the AIF24 fund and several other funds like Infraco Africa, which are investing in infrastructure in Africa, sustainable infrastructure for Infraco through blended finance, PPPs, and so on. AIF50 is also using what they call the asset recycling, which provides a smarter capital allocation. And what do those investors need? They need first a safe lending platform. Then they also need a friendly doing business environment with a stable legal and regulatory framework. And last but not least, of course, they need to have access to the talent pool. And this is what we are offering as financial centers. And I think that Africa needs more financial centers. And by the way, we are cooperating a lot with several financial centers in Africa: Mauritius, Lagos, Kigali, Abidjan, and so on. So what do they need, those investors? I just gave the answer. And let me give you an example of what we have put in place in Casa Finance City, because we have put in place a specific value proposition to attract those investors and to really streamline the investor's critical path. So just an example, because I'm conscious of time. When you're part of CFC, in terms of capital flow, you have the total freedom to manage your assets coming from foreign sources. Also, in terms of people flow, when you're part of CFC, you can hire as many foreign employees as you wish without any restriction. You can hire Nigerian people, people from Kenya, people from Europe, from Japan, from everywhere, without any restriction. And it's really, really important. We see that even within the AIF50 team, for instance, they are hiring people from any part of the world. And it's really important for them. So yes, the ecosystem, really, it's important. I mean, just maybe the last word would be that to close this infrastructure gap, one of the biggest challenges beyond the lack of financing is to have these risk-taking developers that are willing to work on the projects at a very early stage. So we have the Africa50, Infraco Africa, Neotemis, Tassanvaripour. She was here just in the last panel saying that they need to be patient, resilient, and so on. But of course, I mean, those players, they need, again, the right ecosystem, and they need to have streamlined investors' critical path. So,
thank you, Lamia. One of the existing innovative financial model is blended finance, which is really a mix of concessional funding with commercial capital. And I will turn to the banks here. How do you reconcile the need of having returns, and we know bankers are talking a lot about the returns, and you have also the development institutions looking at the social impact in terms of these blending finance proposals. So probably I will turn to Akin if you want to comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. I think blended finance is a very important tool, right? And as a means of using relatively small amounts of donor or concession funding to mitigate against specific investment risks, which helps to crowd in private funding. Because I think fundamentally, as has been outlined already, the DFI funding and the public funding is not going to close the gap that we see in terms of infrastructure and investment in Africa and in the world in general. And you need to find ways to crowd in the private sector more actively. So blended finance is a critical way of doing this. Specifically, some of the investment risks like currency or convertibility or contract risk or political risk can be mitigated through this tool. And to take away some of those risks, it makes it easier for private sector involvement to happen. And it also makes it easier to attain return hurdles. Like you mentioned, return is very important from the private sector perspective. So I think the key challenge really for all the players, including the MDBs or the DFIs, is not just how much direct lending they're putting out there, but also how successful they are and we all are in crowding in private investors. Number of hurdles remain, lots of challenges remain, but I think it's very fundamental to the success. So whether we're talking about first loss or partial guarantees or whichever mechanism you want to think about from a blended finance perspective, that objective is very critical. Challenges remain around harmonizing the treatment across different jurisdictions. So some of these enhancements or products will get you capital relief, say, as a European bank, but not as an American bank. Some of it has to do with, some of the changes have to do with how the rating agencies themselves view these structures. There seems to be a need for greater harmonization, greater standardization, and, not having to go with each structure every time to the rating agencies to get it rated, so that you can benefit from some of the relief that comes from that. We did a partial guarantee, a sustainable bond with the government of Senegal a few years ago, leveraging off a partial guarantee by the AFDB for, I think, about $500 million. And that was one example of the sort of thing that I think we need to do more of, and we all need to do more of across the board, using different structures. So that's sort of the summary of where we think why it's important, and still talking about what has been done and what more needs to be done to be more effective.
Thank you, thank you. Farouk, Yusuf, any complementary views?
Thank you. Just to add, my colleague has said, I think the benefit of crowding in, not just on the funding side, it's also on using resources, because we talk about trying to get more transactions through the pipeline. So you can work with the commercial institutions to use their infrastructure for executing transactions as well as for originating. And I believe that as Standard Chartered, we have been involved in a lot of blended finance transactions in Africa. And we find this as a very good tool to work with the MDBs. First, to leveraging capacity, not just for the funding side, but also for origination and resourcing. Secondly, also the way the instruments, particularly the first loss or the partial credit guarantee instruments are structured, it allows better risk allocation. My colleague talked about regulatory treatment. Also, commercial banks and under the current regulatory treatment, for longer tail risk, the capital requirements go significantly higher, particularly if you are in sub-investment grade borrower territories. And with the rolling guarantee structure, that addresses one of the key issues that commercial banks face, particularly when you're trying to finance long-term projects, as we see a lot of the critical infrastructure projects require long-term funding. And these blended finance tools that we see allow us to allocate risk to where they are better served and allows us to price more competitively on this. So the whole idea is you have concessional, which is in its one end of the spectrum is concessional funding directly from MDBs. You have commercial on the other side, which cannot go to the longer tenors required by the infrastructure projects particularly. And the blended finance gives a very good mix of how we can actually price well below the commercial curves of the borrowers, yet get to the longer tenors which are associated with the projects that we are looking to finance. The other next step, in my view, is around how do we scale these. A lot of these transactions are done as very bespoke transactions where you have a guarantee amount established by an MDB for a particular country based on a request, whether it's policy-based or project-based, and then the market comes in and tries to fund it. I think there is certainly more, and Madam Masatu also talked about originate to distribute. So I think that's where I see a lot of scalability, not just in releasing the capacity of MDBs which exists, but also looking at future. So looking at the synthetic risk transfers, but having a portfolio fund approach to try and use the first loss guarantees and create a fund approach so that you can crowd in private capital, not just from commercial banks, but also from institutional investors who are quite keen to take the duration risk. And I think that's where, going forward, we should look at focusing on and move not just into doing single transactions, but looking at more portfolios for future projects.
No, thanks, Farouk. I think we're going probably to move to the another form of innovative financing, mindful of time. But I just want to probably make a comment here, is that expectations of clients, whether they are sovereigns or corporates, where they hear about blended finance, the expectation on pricing is that it should be much, much more affordable than what it is. So I'm just echoing that, especially for the banks. And that's, the cost of financing has become very, very, important given all the, all the crises that has happened. I think, the possibility of lowering the pricing will definitely be of added value. We'll move to another aspect of innovative financing, which is asset securitization. Obviously, I think we have seen how, existing, cash flow generating assets have been repackaged, for marketable securities. I'm going to turn to Tim and Yusuf on this point in terms of, what, in your view, is working well and what could be improved in terms of these asset securitization transactions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, John Paul. And before I get into the question, let me just say thank you very much and congratulations to the African Development Bank team and all the partners for this event. Hasatu, President Adesina, Max, Fernando, Onike, who've done a fantastic job. This has gone from great to even greater, so congratulations. Just a little, there you go. A little context. During the introduction, I spent 25 years at the African Development Bank. About half of it was in the private sector department, generating assets, and half of it was as the chief risk officer, so both poacher and gamekeeper, so to speak. And it was a great experience. And it was that context that allowed a lot of innovation, because the African Development Bank was capital constrained. But I also understood that there was a significant gap between the perceived level of risk on developing assets, development market assets, and the actual risk. And this really came through in the context of my days in risk management. So we knew that there was an opportunity to be able to package our assets and to create pathways to enable institutional investors, private capital, to support development. And that essentially has become the passion for me for the last decade or so, in finding different pathways, different instruments and bridges to do that. And I think Hassatu mentioned during her introduction the room to run securitization, which was highly innovative at the time, has now been replicated by the Inter-American Development Bank. My gut feeling was that it would have been replicated even sooner if the pandemic had not disrupted a lot of things. And I know that there are other development finance institutions that are looking at replicating even further, enhancing all of that. And I mean, when you look at the securitization, it's quite remarkable, because there was a portfolio, I think 45 assets, different loans across the continent, all private sector that had been originated by the African Development Bank, put into a reference pool, and then securitized and tranching the risk. The junior tranche went to at the time they were called Mariner Capital. I think they're now New Market Capital. I believe they may even be in this room, as a matter of fact. And they were able to bring in 21 institutional investors from across the globe to participate in the risk of a junior tranche. No, nobody would have believed that this was possible, that the risk appetite of those investors would align with that type of portfolio. The transaction was done, I think, a lot in part to a mitigation instrument known as the Global Emerging Markets Database, which was allowed us to understand that gap in perceived and actual risk. And that transaction, I believe, now has officially been wound up with 0 losses, which is quite a remarkable feat. So it's not surprising that that instrument will now be repeated. And I think later on I'm going to talk about another bridge that will enable private capital to support development. Yeah. So
thank you.
Kudos to the African Development Bank, and thank you also for, maybe even more importantly, is being willing to share the knowledge and experience so that others can replicate at lower cost, faster and easier. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Tim. Riyad, you want to react?
Sure. Now that's better. Thank you. So I think the 2 quick points for me. The point of a securitization is to remove an intermediary, which is really adding not much value. So if you take an example of a Zambian copper mine, they have dollar cash flows, and the investors who are wanting to lend into this sector actually want to tap into that dollar cash flows, rather than sending money to a state-owned utility in the middle and then to that. So there is increasingly opportunities out there that we're looking for, and welcome opportunities in this space where we're effectively bypassing government entities in the middle and trying to get to and have security over cash flows that are coming from mines, which also produce dollar revenues, but many other businesses that have a similar sort of cash flows. We're sitting here in Morocco. Morocco has a fantastic set of cash flows. For example, the road that's coming from Rabat to Casablanca, you have to pay tolls. That set of tolls is a very valuable set of cash flows. You can model the cars that are, number of cars that are going. There's a lot of traffic, actually, if I'm honest, which is good for any investors trying to invest into this little road. And there is isolating the state entity away from this cash flow can be a very valuable thing. Just one comment, if I have a very quick one about the blended finance, if I could. Africa needs non-dollar liabilities Africa can pay back local currency, not dollars. It's very hard for them to pay back dollars. So as we think about blended finance models, I think one of the areas that all the multilaterals should really invest into, and you know, AFDB is always at the forefront of stuff, so we're happy to work with you on this, is how to protect against currency risk coming from countries. Because it's very easy to give dollars against your beautiful AAA guarantee in dollars. But Africa needs less dollar liabilities. They don't have the dollars to pay back. They need Naira, they need, you know, whatever other currencies. Back to you.
Thanks, Riyad. I think you're bringing a very interesting point, and I think there's been a lot of perceptions, good or wrong, on hedging. And I think one of the key messages we've been passing to clients and countries is hedging is not about being right or wrong on where, you know, the currency is moving. Hedging is about, you know, having peace of mind and having a clear view on their cost of financing relating to FX. So thanks for bringing that point. We have seen also the emergence of PPPs in the continent. And unfortunately, what we are seeing is, you know, the PPP market is really concentrated in roughly, you know, five African countries. If you take out Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, then we don't see, you know, PPPs being, you know, kind of, you know, rolled out, you know, in a widespread. So the question, I have two questions. One is, why is it that we are not seeing more of PPPs in the countries? And the second question is, you know, especially for the bankers, is, you know, there is a perception that banks are, you know, mostly looking after financing PPP deals, right? And it would be good to probably shed some light to the audience on why so. Why is it that when banks are moving to, you know, to a market, the first thing, one of the first questions they ask that they want to see is PPPs? So I'll leave the honor. Please go ahead.
Okay, so PPP needs a legal system. So what you're actually doing, you take a public asset, again, I'm going to refer back to the Rabat Casablanca Road, is it needs a law that says that there is a public asset that the citizens use that will be handed over to the private sector, and that's quite a critical system. So I think the countries that have been successful in PPPs have largely passed that law. So the first thing really is to do is to have laws that are passed in these countries that allows for private investors to come and create a PPP asset. I think the second thing is the revenue model. Too often there are plenty of projects that don't really have a revenue model. A PPP project doesn't work. You are not going to have a private sector investor come and invest if you don't have revenue collection. So if you marry the two, and the last currency point that I mentioned, which Hassatu will give us a nice cover, you can definitely do PPPs in, you know, any part of the 54 countries in the continent. Thank you.
Farouk, any complementary view?
As a bank which does PPPs in Africa, I have a slightly more conservative view than my friend here. So a lot of countries have done their PPP frameworks, laws, and some are putting into place. One of the challenges that we have seen is that even when there are PPPs which are set up, let's take an example, let's take a port project. Port is an easier one, particularly a busy port. There are investors, there are banks willing to take that view on the concession. However, when we're looking at a PPP, sometimes we've seen that the holistic view is not there. So the port may work, but the infrastructure getting access to the port is still supposed to be provided by the government. And if that doesn't come in, if the roads aren't built, then the port is useless. So you may have a PPP, but if the infrastructure is not there, and similarly we have power projects, but these transmission lines are not there, and transmission lines are still very much outside of the PPP right now, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. And that has caused delays in projects. Now, we've seen sometimes in toll roads as well, lots of successful where we see traffic. There, again, by the time the laws go into place, sometimes it takes many years, and by the end of it all, the costs have gone up. The sponsors are saying, okay, we need to relook at this. If we need to relook at the whole project itself. Do you want to build the 300 kilometers, or could we do 100? And if the government says, yeah, actually probably, because there is some backstop guarantee and we want to reduce that, our exposure, and once they do that, they have to go and retender the whole process. So those are some of the challenges which we have. There have been successful projects eventually. I mean, we took a road project, port project we did, took 6 years to get into place, and a couple of roads are still pending. So I think there is a requirement, and this is where I believe the MDBs do play a role, and sometimes I think there is an opportunity to play more, is to do more of this planning with the government early upfront on PPPs, where not just on the laws, but also on the holistic planning of what surrounding infrastructure the government has to provide for a PPP to successfully happen is required.
And just to add very quickly, I think the challenges with the PPPs reflect sort of the institutional weaknesses that we do have in Africa that need to be overcome, if we're being honest. You talked about the concentration of the PPPs in a few countries. That's true. But even in aggregate terms, I think only about 7% of the global PPP value is done in Africa, which reflects a certain lack of scale anyway. On the public sector side, I think there continue to be technical gaps or issues in terms of expertise and the rule of law and the political side of it, because these projects come with real political risks. And we've seen that like on the Lekki Toll Road in Lagos, that effectively the government had to buy out the private sector and take it over again. Because when it came down to it, the politics wasn't quite right. And then on the private sector side as well, in terms of the understanding of the social benefits and that balance, profit focus is natural, but also there needs to be a more realistic assessment of the political economy and the social situation in the countries to be able to strike the right balance from the private sector side as well. And those fundamental issues need to improve incrementally for this to scale and grow.
No, thanks. No, these are valid points, and I think unfortunately sometimes the time that it takes to kind of seeing those financing via PPPs mature and being disbursed. Africa, unfortunately, for a high growing population, there is definitely a need to accelerate, the pace of, capital raising, and that's, I think, a collective challenge. And Lamia, I will come to you. I mean, we talk about some of the innovation funds that have been set up. We have seen funds targeting, technology, targeting renewables, and so forth. And just wanted to get your views from, Casablanca Finance City in terms of what you are doing in terms of, triggering these funds to, to develop further in terms of innovation.
In terms of innovation, or?
Innovation.
Yeah, because, I mean, we have more infrastructure funds than innovation funds, so to speak. We have some, VCs, but not that much. Okay. But in terms of innovation, yes, we're trying to do a lot. Actually, for us, there are at least 2 mega trends that are shaping the future of finance. The first one is technological innovation, of course, with fintechs, blockchain, AI. And the second one is the rise of sustainability. And I myself, I'm convinced that the future of finance can only be sustainable. So with regards to the first topic, fintechs, actually we launched a few years ago a project called the Africa Innovation Lab. The purpose aims to, we aim to bring together the best innovative startups in the financial sector and connect them to business opportunities around the world. So we have had a 1-year program, acceleration program, across several verticals like RegTech, crowdfunding, ESG, and so on. And today we are about to launch the second cohort. With regards to sustainability, as you may know, today Africa only generates 2% of its estimated potential of carbon credits. And according to the Africa Carbon Market Initiative, the continent could export by 2050 more than 2 gigatons of avoided CO2 emissions. So Africa could really become the energy powerhouse for the world if we put in place the right frame conditions in terms of capacity building, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of financing, and so on. In this context, we believe that the carbon markets, if well designed and implemented, could really represent an untapped avenue to channel investment flows and finance projects in sustainable development in Africa. So we think that we should seize this opportunity, and this is what we're doing in Casa Finance City. We just launched a new project, which is to put in place an ecosystem of carbon carbon players with a VCM, voluntary carbon market, which is innovative by design. So I think that we should really work on that, and for Casa Finance City is doing it for the continent. I know that other financial centers are also working on that, so we can of course collaborate with each other.
Thank you very much. And I think, Tim, you have done. You wanted to share some insights on some of the funds.
Oh yeah, very much so. Thank you. Yeah, when I was speaking earlier about the synthetic securitization that the African Development Bank did, it was primarily motivated from a capital constraint perspective. It turned out to be a great pathway to enable private capital to relieve the capital constraint that the bank was facing. Since my retirement, I joined an organization called ILX, which is part of the Cardano Development Group based in the Netherlands. A fund, ILX, has kicked off a couple of years ago with around $1 billion of capital mobilized principally from, at the time, Dutch pension funds. It's now expanded. I think it's $1.6 billion from including some Danish pension funds and gradually working across Scandinavia. The thesis of ILX is that, and we've been talking about blended finance, is that, in fact, if properly structured, institutional investors do not need blending to be attracted into the development world. And the ILX model is essentially that it does co-financing with the multilateral development banks, the DFIs, that are originating private sector loans, and we co-finance with them on a light touch basis, and that those assets then go into our pool and are attractive from both a financial perspective as well as a development and impactful perspective to institutional investors. Now, this is proof of concept that institutional investors can be attracted to support development working through development finance institutions. And I think it's important to note that the gap between perceived risk and actual risk is particularly clear for when you work with institutions like the African Development Bank, like IFC, like EBRD, the other DFIs that have an ability to mitigate risks at origination. And it's an extremely scalable model. And my expectation is that we'll see lots of other ILXs develop over the next few years. And it will bring a steady stream of institutional capital to support development, which will be great for the multilateral institutions. I think the big sea change that needs to take place at the side of the multilateral institutions, something that was mentioned earlier, is to have a culture of originate to distribute. So you're developing assets immediately with the intention that a good portion of that will be distributed into the institutional markets. And so the projects are structured to facilitate that. And we can see that evolution taking place, and it's only going to accelerate. So it's a really exciting time for all that. Just to say at the end, there is a place for blended finance, no question. As you get into the riskier spectrum of projects, that is required. But for some of the mainstream activities that the development institutions do, there is institutional appetite on a clean risk basis, and that's pretty exciting. So lots of potential for growth.
Thank you. And probably Riyad, from a banker's perspective on carbon credits.
Africa has a vast number of it. This is probably the starting point, but there's really two things that needs to get fixed. I mean, I welcome the initiative from Casa Financity. The first one is that each country has to reduce their baseline carbon calculation for carbon credits to work. And the second one is monitoring. So who can actually catalyze this? If you think about it, who has the gathering power for ensuring every nation, every time there's a carbon credit written, voluntary or otherwise, it's removed from the baseline? It's actually only African Development Bank. So I guess my ask to the African Development Leadership Team is that you really have the opportunity here to catalyze and design something that is transformational, because the amount of capital that is available to come and buy carbon credits that can be, and then the second part, monitored effectively, can have serious impact into the continent.
Thank you. I mean, we cannot talk about innovation without mentioning AI, crypto, blockchain, and I'll be keen to hear some views in terms of how can the continent, benefit from these, emerging technologies, and, and what will be your views in terms of how that can be an accelerator for the financing in the continent.
No takers for that, right? Well, I don't profess to know much about the blockchain and crypto aspect, but I do think that the AI is the space where the next step is going to be, and I think that's going to add more efficiencies. If I just look at it from a financing perspective, I think that certainly is going to be adding to the innovation cycle in terms of how can we use that to make our models work better. If we can have the portfolio models, can they do better? And in that, are we able to turn transactions around quickly? And that would be, for me, the main area for development. And I also think it's agree with Tim that the number of investors, whether they are institutional investors looking at opportunities, even if they are at a higher risk, is growing, and they want to align it with their own development goals. And that means that there is a common space where complementing blend finance with these lending loans would be a way forward, and we'll see some scalability in that.
Thank you. Akin?
I'm going to approach it from a slightly different angle, in fact, an entirely different one. I think I'm going to go old school and talk about domestic market development. I think one of the areas where Africa we have a lot to do is developing our own domestic markets, whether it's fixed income, equities, but building our own capacity internally. We talk about currency risks and the ability to hedge against that. Stronger local markets do give you that. If you can have the right capital formation and then have the right liquidity in secondary markets across the continent, you can achieve a lot more in terms of diversification from a currency perspective, and in terms of building an ecosystem in the countries that allows the economies to thrive without too many external dependencies and risks that make things more complicated. It's not 100% one way or the other, but it helps to have that capacity and depth in your toolbox. And I think as we look at new products and innovations, some of that fundamental work about building liquidity and capacity in our domestic markets, even in smaller countries like, say, the currency zones in West and Central Africa, where you should be able to build one market using a common currency as the strength to provide depth, rather than have rather than have a number of small country markets. I think we should do a lot more to develop that capacity, working with the regional DFIs and the regulators and the governments, and help to mitigate some of our exposure and risk to external debt and finance that complicates debt sustainability and macro issues that we face.
Thank you, Akin. I think we're going to get to closing remarks, and I will ask each one of you to, to say a few words and the key takeaways. I think the idea here is to leverage on the innovative financing models, accelerate the financing of projects, infrastructure projects in Africa. Everybody in this room somehow is affected by the financing gap, in terms of shortfalls in energy, in terms of shortfalls in infrastructure, roads, and so forth. So in closing remarks, what would you, if you have to project yourself, a few years down the line, so we can have a victory speech in terms of how the financing gap has been reduced, what should be done? Anyone?
I think essentially from an innovation perspective, I think some of the products we've talked about are very important, some of the things we've talked about. And getting more collaboration at the global DFI level and with a lot of the, say, G7 economies who are always talking about ways in which they want to assist and support Africa to sort of raise funding and close its gaps. I think some of the coordination at that level has to be better. We talked about harmonized regulations, Basel III treatment across the board. We talked about rating agencies and how they assess some of these products, some of these enhancements. I think improvements in that area would be success in helping to unlock more private sector financing, more private sector funding into Africa to supplement what comes from the DFI world and the public space. So that grand parley between the various stakeholders to achieve some harmonization there will be helpful. Some convening institutions can help there. Maybe the AIF or somebody else who can bring everybody to the table to talk about that. I think that would be success. I think developing our own domestic markets would be success. Greater liquidity, greater depth, greater capital formation in the countries, and creating the ability to use that to mobilize funding for the projects and the infrastructure gaps we see. And of course, better governance and standards on the government side. I think all this, if we can see progress in all these areas a few years from now, I think the landscape would look very different from where we are. There'll always be some gaps, always something to aspire to, but I think we would make tremendous progress.
Thank you.
I'm happy to just say a couple of words on this, if jumping in here. I think it's clear that the development finance needs are way beyond the capacities of the public sector to meet that on its own, and therefore mobilizing the private sector to come in and support development is a critical element. I've talked about two examples of bridges, pathways that have enabled private capital to support development, and they're just two simple examples that are working. I say let's build on those working models to scale, okay? Success will breed more success, and as we narrow the gap between perceived risk and actual risk, I think we would just see a further scaling up of the flows of private capital, and that's only going to be good.
Thank you.
I would think in terms of partnerships, clearly the MDBs have a role to play alongside the commercial institutions, and that crowding in effect is quite going to be important going forward. Adding to that, if there are more guarantee instruments, which we all know brings in more crowding in than direct loans, and I think that the World Bank is also aligning to that. African Development Bank stepped up and done these few transactions, at least 3-4 of these in very short time, which is a proof of concept that the moment you mobilize something like this, there will be takers for it. And I think that's going to be very scalable if the MDB community gets together alongside that.
If I can make a quick one. We talked about today about every type of loan that requires paying back the loan, as in the country or the corporate needs to pay back, except for one. Carbon credit does not need paying back. This is the single biggest, quickest, easiest way to get cash in the door, which does not require paying back.
Thank you.
So I think you've said it all, but let me add the perspective of financial centers again. I think that Africa needs more financial centers, and we are really ready to work together in a co-development and co-emergence approach to help grow the pie and to build institutional capacity, again, to be catalyst and forcing device to have the, you know, the right and conducive business environments for all those investors, banks, all the operators and so on. And thank you to echo my words about the carbon credit opportunity. Again, that is a great, I mean, it's the greatest opportunity in Africa. It's about sustainability, again, because Africa has the greatest potential to make massive leapfrogs. So we absolutely need to seize this opportunity.
No, thank you. And I think that, you know, what comes across very clearly is that, you know, it will empower, you know, different stakeholders, you know, from local communities to global institutional investors to, you know, bankers as well. And, you know, it touches all of us here in this room to be able to make that change. We are all impacted by, you know, all these shortfalls in energy, you know, in road infrastructure. And like we said, it takes a village to raise a kid. But here, what we're saying is really it takes a collaborative effort from all stakeholders to make it happen. So I would like to thank the audience. I would like to thank the experts. A big round of applause for sharing your insight. Thank you very much.